Thanks, Davide. I hope you can see the slides now. Yes, thanks for nodding, Eva. Okay, so we're switching the order of the two papers. So I'll be speaking about the second paper that we've written together in the qualitative work package of the project. And as the paper that Kacper hopefully will present afterwards, it's co-authored by the whole team of people, and I'll just show you them in a minute. This paper is titled Interrogating the Production of Political Remittances, Polish and Romanian Migrants' Comparative Evaluations of Here and There. And it's not a general overview of the data that we have collected. The data has been collected, as Kacper mentioned in his introduction, by these happy people here, Angelina and Gabriella, and Anatoly, and I can see up in the corner also Corina, and then Davide, who's also here, has been coding the data, and then Kacper and I have been contributing in the data collection process as well with the interview guide and analysis and discussions with the team and everything on the way. And so this data set we have analyzed fully, and we're writing several papers, and we've written a sort of summary descriptive report, which is available on the project website and also on the PRIO web pages if you're interested, which says a little bit about descriptively what we did and what we found. Whereas the two papers we're presenting today are more sort of specific analyses into two dimensions of that, and we're still looking into other dimensions that we'll try to write more about in depth. So this one is then about the question of how are political remittances produced? And this speaks to one of the things that Ben was talking about and also Eva was commenting on. So sort of core issues about how do we think that that migration in a way affects different types of change. In this specific context, in the emigration countries, whereas very often in migration studies, there's a huge focus on the immigration context, but here with more focus actually on the emigration context. Although of course political remittances can be understood as something which works in both directions, right? So how migrants affect politically both the emigration and the origin context. And so as you can see here, we're taking a slightly critical approach where we want to interrogate what is going on here. And we actually also want to focus quite specifically on the production of these political remittances, which may or may not have an effect. And we're deliberately taking a very narrow approach because this is a huge question. And like with the quantitative data, we saw there are some opportunities, which I think are really exciting and great, but there are also some limitations. That certainly goes for the qualitative material as well. So rather than trying to do everything, we're actually doing a quite sort of narrow slice here, where we're trying to look specifically at how do political remittances get produced, if they get produced, basically. So I'm going to take you through the paper quite quickly now, and you can rather maybe ask if there are specific questions later, and then I'm really looking forward to the feedback that we'll also receive afterwards. So I'll briefly say a little bit about who our interviewees were, and then very briefly touch on the three key concepts in this paper. So social remittances, which are the sort of the point of departure in a way for this paper, and I think for many of the discussions that we have about political remittances. And then we focus in this paper specifically on interpretative frames. So I'll say a little bit about that as well. Then I'll not present the whole analysis, but I'll give you a few examples of the quotes that we have also in the paper, essentially focusing on comparative evaluation. So how migrants comparatively evaluate the contexts which they, through migration, become familiar with. And we, in this paper, argue that this is quite central to understanding the production of the content, potentially, of political remittances. And so that connects then to the bigger questions in the project in terms of whether these are liberal or illiberal and how we might understand that in a sense. So the specific themes that we are looking into in terms of how people comparatively evaluate them are corruption, public institutions, and democracy itself. And I'll try to present some of the conclusions that we have so far. And this is still work in progress also in this paper, but certainly also because we're working on several other papers. So I really look forward to any questions, also critical ones. Okay, so the question that we ask is this: how do political remittances come into existence? And more specifically, how does migrants' exposure to multiple contexts and the ensuing processes of comparative evaluation of the political environments that they find themselves in translate or not into the contents of what we might describe as political remittances. Just going to try and move this bar away so I can actually see the slides. Okay, here we go. And as with many things, there is, of course, a literature which we're leaning on here and relating very much to. And I'm very happy also to see that in the audience in the webinar, there is a lot of people who have been contributing to this literature as well, and who I know will have very knowledgeable insights into this as well. So one of the key papers I think that have been published in recent years on political remittances in a special issue of GEMS is the one that we take this quote from. The act of transferring political principles, vocabulary and practices between two or more places which migrants and their descendants share a connection with. Political remittances are remolded in a context of migration and can in turn influence political behavior, mobilization, organization, and narratives of belonging in places of destination and origin. So this definition then of political remittances is of course beyond just the question of voting, right? But it clearly connects also to how we might try to understand and interpret voting behavior as well, but just to point that out. And also that it indeed is in a way understood increasingly, I think, as a two-way thing. So it's not just about how migrants move away somewhere and then affect their country of origin, but it could be much more about the sort of circulation of ideas and ideologies and thoughts back and forth in terms of how migrants might affect countries both of settlement and of origin. Okay, so we did, as Kacper also mentioned, 80 semi-structured interviews in Oslo and in Barcelona with Romanian and Polish migrants. Briefly then, of course, this sample is not representative of the migrant populations in those cities, but we did try to get a variation in terms of the different types of migrants that we interviewed. So in terms of length of stay, we tried to opt for people who had migrated as far as possible within the period since EU accession, but not only those, but we're focusing more on those maybe than the earlier mobility waves. But we also didn't want to have people who were circulating only and had only been in the country of residence for a very short period. So we wanted to have people who actually had some exposure to that context. The people that we interviewed were largely only citizens of their country of origin. I think that's very usual in the EU context anyway, but that was certainly the case here as well. In terms of educational level, I think as very usual in these types of studies, many interviewees have higher education than the average in a way would be. But I think given the education levels in Poland and Romania, what we have here is not too far off, although of course I think as with these types of studies, it is a bit skewed towards more educated rather than less. We also looked into questions about contacts, which have been touched on a little bit, I think, in some of the questions also in the chat. So the people that we interviewed were in a few instances actually receiving economic support from their country of origin. So what we term, financial reverse remittances. But the more common form of remittances from the migrant back to their family in the place of origin was also something that we saw. And I think quite reflective of EU migration. This is hard to measure in the sense that households kind of are split, right? Then it's really hard to measure maybe exactly who is sending what at which point, but there was more support going in this direction than then in the other. And also reflecting this pattern of EU migration, which is open-ended. Many of the respondents also owned real estate back in Poland and Romania. If you want more interested in who the interviewees were and more in the methodology, you can find that in the report that I mentioned, which is on the project website already. So briefly, in terms of the key terms that we're using, we're building this paper around basically, as a point of departure, this term that Peggy Levitt coined in 1998, social remittances. And there's been quite a lot of work on that since. But a lot of that work has been focused indeed on potential impacts of social remittances. And so in this paper, we're deliberately saying that's very important and interesting. We're not focusing on that. Instead, we try to focus on how do such ideas that might circulate actually come into being. And we in a way take a little bit of a critical stance to the idea of labeling as remittances in the sense that they're not something that's being sent from one place to another, but it's rather something which is circulating and which is changing in that process as well, which is why we refer to it a little bit as an elusive empirical mechanism. We also discussed the same issue that was mentioned earlier in terms of political remittances as, does that mean remitting democracy? And as also both Ben and Eva mentioned, there's a huge literature on this, and increasingly it's becoming more critical to whether this is in a way the right question. So certainly there have been examples of that, but there's been examples of many other forms of political ideas circulating as well, and maybe it's as interesting in a way to explore those as well. What we focus on in this paper then is how does the fact of migration in itself actually matter here? So how does it matter that people are acquainted with and familiar with two different contexts? And what does that do to how they assess which types of policies and political solutions they think are the good ones, the right ones, and perhaps the ones that they would vote for, or that they would speak with their families in context of origin about and encourage? So we focus on the effect of comparative evaluations. And this is something that actually was introduced in this same article by Peggy Levitt in '98, and it draws on work by Portes and Zhu from '93. So it's sort of ideas that have been floating around, at least in migration studies, in terms of how migration changes people's opinions and views potentially. But somehow it's not really been the focus of that much attention in the research, probably because people have been interested in the effects of social remittances or of migration in origin context more than in the process of what happens inside migrants' heads. Also probably because it's kind of hard to figure that out, and we acknowledge that as well. So in the paper, we try to move from a model that was created by Levitt in '98, where she focused on the content creation, so kind of the ideas and themes, and then very much the transmission, right? So do people go visit? Do they speak to family? How strong are these transnational social networks? Do they return? These kinds of issues. And then what is the impact? And of course, then it's hard to measure the impact, because what is the effect of globalization or exposure in general versus migration? But you can still maybe see there are some diaspora returns, there are diaspora programs, the different ways in which you might try to sort of tease out what the impact is. And then, as you can see in part 2 of the model, we basically, in this paper, focus on the content creation part, and then not even all of that, because we really try to focus on what is this exposure that we're speaking of in terms of migrant being exposed to two different contexts, or sometimes even more than two if they've migrated to other countries as well. And how is it that they actually compare these contexts? Do they compare them? And then if so, in what kinds of way? And then we sort of move slightly into how does that then become articulated perhaps in ideas, but we didn't in this paper really have space to go into that in depth too much yet. Right, so I'm going to share a few quotes to illustrate the ways in which migrants actually speak about these things. And these are, of course, select quotes, and there's more in the paper itself. And actually in the report that I was mentioning, we've summarized some of the themes where migrants discuss these different things also. So if you're interested in the sort of what do the migrants actually say themselves, you can read that report as well. So on the theme of corruption, I have this example. When I talk to my friends who are more integrated here, they tell me that it is the same as in Romania, but at the same time, I have doubts about this. When you are here, you get hit by corruption here. It seems to you here, it is corruption like there, but in reality, things are probably very different. That is, the phenomena are similar, but the magnitude is different. So this is someone we've labeled Maris, it's a pseudonym, who's a Romanian migrant in Barcelona. And I think this quote is very illustrative, of how there's a sort of comparison going on, both at the individual level, but you can also see the migrant community level coming in. And there's kind of a sensitivity already there to length of stay, perhaps, to how exposed, how knowledgeable you are about the context that you're in terms of how you might compare it to what is going on. But I think importantly also, and this should come as no surprise, I think, it's very often a matter of degree. So it's not either or, right? And there's kind of an acknowledgement of that, yes, corruption is an issue in this context, and it is there. It doesn't quite look the same. What do we make of this? So it's very much a question of degree, and also of length of stay, perhaps in the context of emigration, as something which appears, in this migrant's view at least, to be something which probably affects how you evaluate this as well. So moving to someone we named Denisa, who's also a Romanian migrant in Barcelona. She refers to the health sector, and there was quite a lot of different types of quotes which referred to public institutions, which we thought were interesting also in terms of sort of evaluating the different contexts against each other. So she said, I prefer to go to the doctor in Spain, not because they have better doctors than they're in Romania, but because they are doing their job better, because they're more motivated. In Romania, doctors aren't paid as they should be. And so this is one of the many examples that we had in the data set, which are not very much closely linked to kind of party politics, certainly. They're sort of linked to trust in public institutions in in an indirect way, I think, but they're very sort of indirect in the connections that they make. And I think this is a quote which again exemplifies the ways in which migrants do compare, but they do compare these contexts based on actually knowing quite a lot about both of them. So they acknowledge that there are differences, but it's not a case of like, this is better here, this is better there, and that's it. They actually go into a sort of in-depth thought process of explanation in terms of, why might these differences be the way that they are? And also in terms then of how the public institutions are working. And in this context, it's a negative positive, which is quite easy to find, I think, in terms of one context being seen, after all, is better than the other. Then again, on public institutions, and this is a migrant we've called Zofia. She's from Poland and lives in Oslo. And she's saying, in this whole difficult and stressful situation, this was in the context of the pandemic, the interview was conducted in April. She said, I'm, for example, at home for the 4th week. I practically don't leave the house. I don't know if my business will survive, but I know that I will have something to eat because Norway will take care of me. And from that angle, Norway has, and the social policies are very fair, that they really want to help you. Whereas in Poland, there are often political games, in my opinion. Now, I should stress in our material, we do have Polish migrants who might be saying the opposite, and it's not like they love public institutions in Norway necessarily. So just with that caveat said, I think what we see from this quote here is, again, the sort of quite in-depth engagement with what public institutions are and how migrants feel that they can relate to them or can trust these public institutions in the context of emigration and of immigration. And I think it's interesting in terms of how we then might approach the question of how does then this comparative evaluation feed into how migrants might want to remit political values or opinions or beliefs to the country of origin, or indeed want to affect political processes in the country of settlement as well. Another quote again from the Norwegian context. This is someone we've named Lena, also from Poland, and she says, I don't know if you heard, but in Norway you wish each other good elections before voting. And that's it's a celebration of democracy. How you wish Merry Christmas, you wish happy elections. And maybe this kind of attitude, if the authorities made this a holiday. So here she's really reflecting on democracy itself in a way, and on the process of elections and how you think about what elections are. And again, it's based on a quite sort of in-depth knowledge of both contexts, of having been exposed to the electoral process in both countries and having participated in it at the local level in the Norwegian context as well, and sort of reflecting on, what does democracy actually mean in these different types of contexts. And I think this quote is interesting because it sort of says something about how migrants relate to the electoral process, but at a kind of much more meta level than which party they would vote for, perhaps. But they do really reflect on how democracy works or doesn't work, and what might be benefits or limitations in both countries of settlement and countries of origin. And it's certainly not the case that they necessarily prefer the situation in the country of settlement at all. It varies a lot. But I think it's interesting that they reflect on this at a kind of more meta level, perhaps, than just at which party should I be voting for. And I think it's interesting to think about this, because I think these conversations probably should be linked, but I'm not really sure how yet. So I'd be interested to hear also if some of the panelists and also maybe other people in the audience have comments on that. This is the final quote I want to share with you before I conclude. And this is a quote then from a Polish migrant living in Barcelona, and we've named her Dominika. I think in Spain, freedom of speech doesn't function well. There is freedom of speech, but it has to be according to the norms presented by the European Union. That means that I have the freedom of speech so I can speak well about migrants, Islam, but I don't have that freedom of speech if I wanted to glorify Christians. That's what I think. Some people are supported while others are stigmatized. That's the European Union's direction. That's why Poland isn't popular in the EU, because it goes in a different direction. It's a bastion which doesn't allow Islamic migration or building mosques. So there is freedom of speech, but only according to guidelines of the EU. I can't really say what I want or what I like. So in this context, Dominika is kind of portraying perhaps what some people might expect to be Polish migrants' views in terms of this idea of, democratic backsliding and potentially illiberal political remittances as well. So one of the reasons why I wanted to share this quote as well is just to show you that we do also have these kinds of views in the material, and they're not dominating. Why that is, I'm not quite sure, but also just to say that, of course, these voices are also there. And it's interesting then to reflect on how that in a way matters in terms of what sorts of political remittances this person might want to be sending, and or how that in a way resonates with the social networks that Dominika has in Poland. So is she kind of still then part of a transnational network where this is kind of the bubble that she is in? Is it because she's living in Barcelona? Is it because of who the other migrants who are living in Barcelona is? It's probably partly connected to all of those different types of reasons. But it illustrates, I think, some of the complexity then of trying to understand how migrants can affect politics in the country of origin, both through the electoral process, but also through other things that happen sort of in parallel to the voting itself. So to come to the conclusion then, this is the question that we were asking, and then we wanted to focus on how exposure and comparative evaluation specifically can help us to try and understand what political remittances are and how migrants might be engaging in sort of trying to shape and affect the politics back in the countries of origin. And as I said, we sort of start to touch on articulation, but we stop short of actually responding properly to that in the paper. So what we find is non-linearity and inconsistencies in migrants' views. And this is hard to show you through quotes because I only showed you one from each person. But we could have showed you 5 from each person. And in many instances, they are quite non-linear and inconsistent within themselves in their own interviews. So it's not like they necessarily have one type of views which points in one political direction within one person themselves. And we certainly know that this also reflects the fact that they might be voting differently in the country of origin and settlement, which is, I think, an interesting puzzle for political scientists, how to make sense of that. And then the question of migrants as agents of change, and this speaks to why we in a way are stopping a little bit short of the articulation as part of the paper that we wanted to be engaging with, because we actually find quite a lot of no desire to engage in trying to change the politics in the country of origin. Also, we find quite a lot of no faith in the possibility of political change in the country of origin. So in this context, that's Poland and Romania. And also not interested in taking the role of being agents of change. So not caring, because they do care, they're very often interested in follow, but actually not sort of being interested in being that kind of agent of change. And yet we do also find that migration does change migrants in different kinds of ways, including in how they see the world. So clearly it must affect their political views and values and opinions. So what then happens with these effects in a way? Is it the case that they sort of stay in the private sphere, in the family? Is it the case that they just sort of live in a sort of dual, I'm here, I'm like this, I vote like that. In that context, I vote with my family. So that's kind of how I relate to that context. What does that actually do? And I find that in migration studies, certainly we don't really have very good answers to those questions yet in terms of migration changes people, but what actually happens with that then? And rather in contrast, it seems to be the case that in immigration contexts, the immigration society is saying you're not changing enough to become like us. Whereas in the emigration context, there are all kinds of pressures in terms of what migrants might or might not do. Very often, I think, in countries where there's kind of a great wealth gap between the emigration and immigration context, that's financial. And in other contexts, there are expectations of the sort of democratization. So I think it's still an interesting puzzle and interesting that we don't really have that much conclusive evidence, I think, on this question yet. But I know that my discussant has worked a lot on these things, so she might actually have more answers on these questions than I do. So I look very much forward to hearing from you. I'm not sure whether Kacper is back yet, but I'll just pass it back to you, Maria. Thanks, Kacper.
Thank you very much, Marta. And I just passed the floor to Maria.
Thank you very much. First of all, Eva, I would like to thank you for this invitation, for being on the advisory board of this project and being able to view it, how it really emerged. I mean, when was the last meeting we had in 2019? It has really grown substantially on the quantitative and the qualitative dimension since then. So congratulations on that. And I also wanted to say that I think, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that your data set, especially on the quantitative side, is the first that is of that kind of huge magnitude that is being in the field. So I think you will have a lot of data and a lot of work to compare with. I found, for example, very interesting, I mean, probably very interesting implications on how over time you may see a little bit more illiberal voting, and that may be from the data, although you find that they're still liberal, but still that was coming from some of the cases. So that may be very interesting to what degree it really mirrors the context in which people were embedded because of the democratic backsliding in Europe and in general in the world. But I think this is congratulations from me for this excellent work that you have done there, also on the quantitative side. So my job today is to comment on the Marta's paper, collective paper that has been incorporating a lot of people on the project, as I understand. Very interesting because the design is connecting different groups from countries of the north of Europe, I mean, not a European Union country, right? Norway, and Barcelona, which is in the European Union, also has a little bit like self-sustained tendencies, which they may come somehow into the picture, which they are not in the paper, but you may want to think about this if you were to do the research in Madrid or if you do them in Barcelona, whether it would have been the same. So for me, I like the paper because it really brings this dimension of the gap that I agree with Marta and colleagues that the content creation of these political remittances has not been discussed. And yet, even also my work with the ERC project, Diasporas and Contested Sovereignty, was more about diaspora mobilizations. And it was not about Eastern European, but others. So it was about how you take certain ideas and make them into action. Peggy Levitt was talking about these transnational processes, about what do you do with them, rather than how do you think about the formulation. So you're taking that step back, which I think is very good. So the question then is, how do you use that idea about the interpretative frame, which I think is an interesting lens, analytical lens to go through, but it may need a bigger attention about what and how is interpreted and by whom, right? Because this is certain kind of like a narrative approach that needs to be thought about. And then because you asked me also about how this would really translate into a political action, I will come to that end. But I think this is in the world of narrative analysis. So, and as you say, it's critical. So maybe digging deeper into that kind of how do you create the narrative analysis and the analytical frame of these interpretative frames may be a good way to go. I wanted to say something that kept on coming throughout my reading, but also throughout your discussion today, and it is the idea about exposure. And I think it's a really interesting thing, maybe even more so than you kind of flag it into the paper, because these different people from the different communities in the different cities, right? I mean, personally not country, but like, I mean, the different places, right? They are exposed, but very differentially. And you saw, for example, on your example, the person who was reflecting on yet another one, as it's one of these mirror into mirror stories, right? In which basically you see the stories of two people. The one person considers themselves not that integrated and comments on the more integrated one, where you already see two individuals perceiving and creating potentially the content of that remittance in a different way about corruption. Right, in which the exposure apparently of the first person, the integrated, is that they have been more integrated. What does this mean? Right, digging deeper into that, whether in the interview or in a future work, may be interesting. But also the person is like, I'm not as integrated, right? What does this mean for their own perception of the creation of the remittances? I think it's very good that you are looking into that simultaneity, right? And I find a very big parallels with my work in the book Diaspora Entrepreneurs and Contested States. So just kind of to say, my book came out with Oxford recently, which is exactly looking into how different diaspora entrepreneurs are connected to different contexts, and what does it mean to be connected to context. Maybe you're connected more to political activism, or you're connected to certain non-political areas of life, and you are connected differently at different times. So one person maybe be connected closer to context of the host land than to homeland, and the other way around. So depending on these measures, I don't want to bring the ideas of my book here, but it's more this kind of positionality in which people are embedded may actually have to do a lot with the narrative they create, right, about that interpretative frame. So if you dig a little bit deeper about the exposure part, because somebody who is not very interested in voting in one way or another, they may just have a very withdrawn statements. I mean, one of these, for example, about the medicals sounded like to me a very kind of like hands-off statement, right? I mean, the doctors are very good here, but they are there, but just what do you do with that? So this is because the person is maybe not very politically exposed. So for me, the interesting thing, apart from the idea that, you know, you have the gap very well figured out, then the idea about the exposure and the interpretative frame, the third thing for me, maybe, which could be flagged a bit better, is about who are these 80 people? Because on the basis of who these are, and it sounded to me, these are not diaspora entrepreneurs that I would put them, right? These are not very politically active people. These are general random people, but maybe they're not, right? So I'm not in a position to figure this out. The question is, if these are random people and you're expecting from them to have a political action, the question is on which level, so in what way would they create that kind of narrative about the political remittance? And what it seems from the paper, but also from your presentation, is that there is quite a lot of critical thinking, passivity at the same time. And this somehow I don't think it's contradictory to the idea about earlier parts of the project that were discussed about how people vote, because these kind of latent ways of interpreting realities and voting that are both with regard to the homeland and the hostland, they can be mobilized, right? Whomever can come and say, yeah, I mean, this is very bad to have like bad trust in institutions. Now, tomorrow, I can give you this with some populist vote. I mean, think about what was the recent Bulgarian election. I mean, you gave a lot of Bulgarian election examples recently about some kind of inchoate party coming and mobilizing and just kind of disappearing, probably in the diaspora again. So that is the latency, in my view, that can be mobilized. And in this way, you could see like the translation of what you find as the political remittance to where it might go in a politically voting sense or any other, right? If you ask people, are they communicating these people to these values to people in the homeland, or do they do something about that? I do not know whether these were part of the questionnaire, because you said that you have a data set, but I mean, the paper didn't have like a coding frame attached, so I didn't know that. So this is really interesting to see how all of this could really be thought. And I really like the fact that you're looking into both contexts, because this is something that, I mean, Eva has been working on, but for a very long time has been either the country of origin or the country of settlement, rather than thinking about these dualities in a more systematic way. I like the idea about the non-linearity. I would just kind of push you a little bit further to explain what this means, right, in the context in which you work. But I'm happy to continue the conversation beyond also this venue. But thank you very much for an interesting read, and good luck with the publication of the paper. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Maria. Marta, do you want to respond to some of those points?
I'm also very conscious of the time, Kacper, and I think we need to make sure you actually present the other paper as well, but I can maybe touch briefly on a couple of points, if that's okay. Yeah. Thanks, Maria. These are excellent points. I was frantically trying to take notes, and I will maybe take you up on the offer of following up outside of this context as well. The paper is in review, so depending on how those reviews come back, I will I'll probably engage back with you. But I think these are really excellent points. And I agree with you that there's probably more we could do in terms of this interpretative frames and the narratives. I don't have a ready answer, but I think you're right there. So I think we definitely should take that challenge on as well. And I'm relieved that you agree that the gap is there, because that was one of the things we were wondering about. I mean, knowing the literature, but even so, it's I'm glad we haven't missed any huge contributions there. In terms of who we spoke with, yes. So there is much more attachments in terms of the interview guide and the code book that I'm happy to share as well. We have the same problem in a way, I think, often as one does in all studies when one samples anyone at all anyway, right? So ideally, we'd have migrants from the same place in Poland and the same place in Romania who would be living in the same neighborhood in Oslo and in Barcelona, and it would be perfect. But then it doesn't really work like that. So we have people in these two cities, and yes, we could discuss why Barcelona and not Madrid, of course, and also why Oslo and why not, I don't know, Berlin or London, right? But it is what it is, and I think it brings a lot to the discussion. But we do have a challenge in that we know where these people are from in Poland and Romania, but of course it's not a representative sample, right? So we can't really make that much of it, but we can certainly try and contextualize it more in that sense. And we do also have data on the levels of contacts and which types of issues they discuss with family or with others, etc. But I think, yes, these are certainly not diaspora entrepreneurs, and our idea was to try and have whatever the average voter might be. So that was kind of in a way to try and match the quantitative part of the study, to try and have like people who vote or not. And then we realized, of course, that many people in the diaspora don't vote. So we wanted to ensure not to oversample on people who vote, because in a project like this, that would quickly happen. But so we do have people who don't vote. And I won't say more about that because Kacper will, but that's kind of one of the things that we wanted to try to do. But that's also probably why a lot of the people we spoke with are not that engaged, because most people in general in any society are not that engaged, even in their, the society they live in the politics there. So that's probably part of the answer there. But I'm happy to continue this elsewhere, Maria. Thanks again.
Thank you very much, Marta. I apologize once again for dropping out for a moment, and thanks for taking over. I'll just quickly move to, since there are no questions in the Q&A, and we can take some more afterwards, I'll just move to my presentation, which will give some of the rationale for looking at Barcelona and Oslo, and then Norway and Spain, particularly, and also Romania and Poland. So in this paper, we tackle this really grand question: why some people vote, why some people don't, and why actually so few migrants decide to show up at the ballot box. So why is the turnout among migrants so low? And this has been observed by many people already. I mean, Eva also has a paper on this, and on average, the turnouts among migrants are really very much below the already low turnouts in Central and Eastern Europe, although those have been rising, and we also see rising turnouts in among the diaspora. Of course, there's some fluctuation, but still. So the puzzle, I mean, a majority of immigrants do not participate in elections, and actually, this is really, I mean, to take part in election or not is really the most basic political decision in a democratic system. So why don't they vote? And the classic political science response about why people participate politically, that's Brady, Verba, and Schultzman, and they say, well, because they can't, because they don't want to, or because nobody asked. So we try to do a similar thing, I mean, inspired slightly by Brady, Verba, and Schultzman, and to actually consider 3 sets of factors that might influence people's decision to vote. And one is, do they desire to vote? So what are the internal motivations to stay home or to make their way to the polling station? Are they encouraged to vote? So what are the outside elements of mobilization? And can they vote? So this is the question about access, eligibility, and also the technicalities or modalities of voting, the administrative and logistical factors that account for making it more or less difficult to actually participate in voting. And we look at three, well, LOTSI, so three places where this occurs. Those factors can occur at the country of residence level, at the country of origin level, and also things that are inherently transnational. So they only really relate to migrant voters and not to people voting in either country A or country B, but the fact that their kind of their positionality as migrants creates those or enhances those factors. And as has already been said, 80 interviews, migrants from two of the among the largest sending societies in Central Eastern Europe and Europe in general, living in Spain and Norway. The reason for this is that we have very different diasporas there, and also people with actually very different political views. I will not go into the details of the coding now because there's not much time, but it is covered in the report and also in the paper, which should be out any day now, I hope. So why Spain and Norway? Well, first, there's a level of symmetry there. The Poles are the largest European, or actually now the largest migrant group in Norway. Now it's around 120,000, and they're the fifth European group of migrants in Spain, also a similar number. Now, Romanians, exactly the opposite, number one in Spain, officially 600,000, but actually more, and fifth in Norway if you only count EU nationals, with 10 to 15,000. There's actually the fact that Norway is not a member of the EU doesn't really influence the political situation here and the kind of the opportunities structure, because well, laws regarding residence as well as participation in elections is actually the same as in, say, Sweden, but Norway was much more of a destination for post-accession migration than, for instance, Sweden or Denmark. So that's also a reason to choose Norway, not just because the project is well based in Norway, but there are also important differences in terms of how those migrants vote. And if you look at this, I mean, the boxes here are obscuring some of the view for me at least. You will see that, for instance, in the Polish election in 2015, which were kind of the motivator for this project in the first place, there was a really big difference between how voters in Norway and in Spain voted. And in Spain, and this is something that you have already seen on the maps that Michał has shown, Spain has been this kind of liberal and left-leaning diaspora, whereas Norway is much more right-leaning. And this has been consistent across elections, actually. And if you look at Romania, there's also big differences, actually more, I would say, the other way around. So Romanians in Oslo are the more right-wing liberal, whereas the Romanians in Barcelona are probably the more, well, left-wing, although there's problems here regarding what left and right means in this particular context. And if you look at presidential elections, you will see really strong differences in terms of support for different candidates. Moving on to the actual material, and we divided this in 3 sections. So following this desire, mobilization, and ability to vote, we identify a number of factors. I would not go into the details of all of them, but as far as desire is concerned, well, obviously, interest in homeland politics is going to condition whether you want to participate in external voting or not. But there are also interesting things here. One is that, well, interest in homeland politics, at least in our sample, which, as Marta said, is not representative, but it at least shows the possibilities of different postures among the migrants, is that interest in homeland politics is not fully determined by the length of stay. So some people will remain interested in homeland politics for a long time. Some people would be still, political migrants from the 1980s, of course, or people who came to Norway or Spain in the 1990s, and they would still be very much interested. And there would be those who lose interest immediately after migration, like 2 years later, and they say, I don't want to have anything to do with this. Another really interesting thing we found, and this is something that I think deserves a separate paper more bordering on political philosophy, is that we noticed two clashing notions of citizenship, one based on residence and one on national identity. So some people were saying that because they do not live in those countries, they don't feel that they have the legitimacy to actually take part in elections, that it would be wrong morally to decide for people who are there from this kind of outside perspective. And this, of course, is consistent with the critique of external voting as such in the literature. But also we had those people who were saying, well, as long as I have my citizenship and my nationality, I'm part of this community, I have the right to vote. And then there was also, again, an interesting caveat there, that people were emphasizing, well, we don't have the right to participate in national elections in the countries of residence. So if we were deprived of the right to participate in national elections in descending countries, then we would be left in this kind of limbo, and we would not have a chance to express our political views at all. So it is connected to enfranchisement in the host countries, which is, again, a big debate going on. So I look forward to some comments on this. I know that there are some people in the audience who have written about this. And then there was this idea of civic responsibility for the country of origin. So this is what we would expect the diaspora entrepreneurs in Maria's sense to represent. The idea that you want to teach, or you want to do something, or you want to influence the reality of the homeland in some way. Now, regarding mobilization to vote, well, we were looking for signs of official as well as bottom-up campaigns aimed at increasing turnout. There are official campaigns, however, embassies and ministries of foreign affairs would be disappointed to hear what our migrants were telling us about these. They were generally either not noticing them or thinking that they were just a nuisance and not really motivating anyone in particular ways. Now, bottom-up campaigns, WhatsApp, the networks, things like this is something that people pointed to as really important. And now, regarding political parties, well, there's an important element here. Different sending countries have different regulations regarding how the votes of migrants are counted, and this influences the way political parties can actually mobilize around the diaspora vote. Countries like Romania have separate seats in the parliament reserved for the diaspora constituency. Poland, on the other hand, counts all the diaspora vote into the district of Warsaw, where they disappear because there are so many voters in the district of Warsaw that no matter how many migrants showed up for voting, they wouldn't really matter that much. It's around 10-15%. And so we see different levels of political party engagement. Romanian political parties are much more active than Polish ones. And there are, so those are kind of obvious objective reasons for this. And we probably would see the same things if we looked at other countries as well, depending on the system. And then there's an interesting thing, feeling of marginalization can work in two ways in terms of mobilizing or demobilizing. So some people reported that they feel demobilized to take part in elections because nobody cares about them. Whereas others said, because nobody cares about us, we have to act and we have to take matters into our hands and we have to actually support someone who might be willing to listen to us. And then the ability to vote, a big discussion here about voting modalities. So the possibility of postal voting or not, which is taken away or granted. However, these things are not really simple and straightforward. For instance, Romanians had a chance to vote by post, but they had to register very early, and actually the process was not necessarily so easy. Whereas in Poland, you could not vote by post, but you could register for the vote 2 days before the actual election, and that was really just an automatic thing you did online. So if you wanted to do a last-minute decision, you were actually more able to take part in the Polish election than the Romanian election. But of course, distances matter, and in a place like Norway, it matters a lot. But then the number of polling stations is also important, and this varies from election to election, actually. Another interesting thing we found at queues where the images of long queues are kind of symbolic for external voting, I think. And in Romanian elections a couple of years ago, we even had riots in front of embassies where people realized that they will not get a chance to vote. And we also noticed that people interpret those things differently or see this differently. Some people were discouraged by the fact that there are queues and that they will be made to wait longer. Others, when they saw those long queues, they sometimes really just decided, okay, so now I really want to cast my vote because I see that they, meaning the party in power, don't want me to do this because they're kind of putting up all those different obstacles, and I will try to do this as much as I can. However, I mean, to summarize, it's, yeah, I know it's a general problem with research and qualitative research in particular, perhaps, is that, well, things are difficult and nuanced. So one migrant put it this way: sincerely, I did not intend to vote because I did not want to pass my day up in the gigantic queue. And my other reason was that I did not know who to vote for, although I don't know if this one vote of mine would change anything, but I did not want to decide for those people that lived in Poland. So as you can see, there's at least 4 justifications for not voting in this one single quote. But this is not someone who has not been politically active before. So did you vote when you lived in Poland? Yes, always. It's really interesting. I think it probably not conclusive, but at least worth signaling. This is a summary of those factors which we were able to identify. Of course, I think it's a good departure point for more quantitative, maybe survey-based research to actually look deeper into the way those factors interact. We were not able to do this with the material we have. So we see this exercise as mostly mapping the determinants of external voting. And the 3 insights that we can generate from this already is that voting behavior is not a binary variable in people's experience, so they can vote in one election, not vote in another. And this finding is really problematic for our work package 2, meaning the quantitative work package, because it just shows that the people we're looking at in different elections might be very different people. And yeah. And then both political dynamics in the country of settlement and origin matter, but in varying ways. And this is something we at least can do something about with the quantitative data. And then the interesting thing is that, of course, migrants are motivated by rational factors and they calculate, but there was also some value rational moral logic of legitimacy which was important in motivating people to vote or not. So either feeling part of the national community or not wanting to decide for those who are back home. All right, thank you very much for this. I'll stop sharing now.
Thanks very much, Kacper. I think we'll pass straight on to Christian Jepke. It's wonderful to have you with us. So the floor is yours.
External voting, what is it a case of? At first sight, it is a case of external citizenship, and there's a growing literature on that. External citizenship, more and more countries facilitate the retaining or the recovery of citizenship amongst their immigrant or expatriate populations, and also they increase the possible things that one can do with that external citizenship, particularly the voting and political participation. This is part of a larger trend towards transnationalism, which we know from one of its classical formulations and earliest formulations is not exclusively a migrant related phenomenon or migrant driven phenomenon, but states are active participants in that, building and retaining ties with indeed the diasporas abroad for economic reasons, but also for political, cultural, and in many cases openly nationalistic reasons. That's a part of the interesting dialectic that globalization is not just de-ethnicizing the world, making it more liberal of sorts or neoliberal. It also re-ethnicizes, and transnationalism is part of that very interesting dialectic. Now, in the literature, external citizenship is then mostly looked at from the point of view of democratic legitimacy, or rather that external citizenship creates and aggravates democratic legitimacy problems. And that is mostly with respect to dual or multiple citizenship holders, because the democratic principle of one person, one vote, of course, is busted or is extinguished in the case of multiple citizens who then have the right to even participate in national elections in more than one country. Now, at first sight, that is, external voting is a case of this debate, discussion literature concerning external citizenship. However, that is only at first sight, because you're dealing with an internal European Union process, and this external citizenship and its democratic legitimacy problems is mostly outside of the European Union, or in the context of third state citizens to the degree that they are residing in the EU. You are dealing with a case of in a way practicing EU citizenship, or practicing citizenship within the European Union, where it is totally normal that you exercise national voting rights only in your own country, your country of original citizenship, and then you have additional local and supranational possibilities of participating by way of European law, European Union law. So this fact that you're dealing with external citizenship within the European Union in a way minimizes the problem, the normative problem of external citizenship, which is usually highlighted by external citizenship studies. And actually, that you're dealing with external citizenship within the European Union justifies the purpose of the paper, and I quote, to offer a framework which can be used to inform policy development aimed at increasing external voter turnout. You know, I found that statement initially puzzling, because it's taken for granted that to increase external voter turnout is ipso facto a positive thing. In the genuine context of external citizenship, this is actually the problem, and you wouldn't want states to go too much into this problematic direction. I mean, obvious cases here are what Viktor Orban did with respect to the Hungarian diasporas in Romania and Slovakia, simply granted them external citizenship with the immediate effect that his dictatorship is being consolidated with the help of these new Hungarian voters, citizen voters. Okay, now I almost passed my 5 minutes, but I have not really said anything substantively yet. There are two interesting observations in the paper which I would like to put my finger on. I still have these 2 minutes to say that. Kacper, yeah. The first interesting observation is about the political preferences of Romanians and Poles in these two cities. And you mentioned it again in your presentation here. In 2015, Poles in Norway predominantly voted right populist for PIS, nice acronym anyway to call these guys PIS with a double S, actually it should be. While in Spain, they voted left liberal, this kind of the equivalent Polish diaspora. In 2016, in the case of Romania, you had the opposite preferences in both countries and both cities. So I simply would have liked to figure out more of what conditions these different preferences, these variations are simply puzzling. They are puzzling in their inverted constellations, comparing Poles and Romanians here in these two different cities. But they're also puzzling in light of a very extraordinary book, which I recently read, like probably many of you, by Ivan Krastev and Stephen Holmes, The Light That Failed, about the failing liberalism in Eastern Europe and some other countries. From Holmes and Krastev's perspective, you see a dystopian Eastern Europe that is brain drained and youth deprived. They're smart people, they're young people going in hordes abroad, so that the home populations are increasingly the peasants of the hinterland, who then, of course, consolidate populist rule in these intelligence and youth deprived countries. Now, from their perspective, the very fact of rightist populist voting, at least by some immigrants, is simply puzzling. So to make sense of such variations, one would need much more information about the demographic and social profile of the respective diasporas and the voting portions of them. And this paper just unfortunately doesn't give any clues in that respect. A second observation, also mentioned in the brief presentation by Kacper, about the desire to vote, one of your three categories of analysis here, the desire to vote. Some voters consider it simply illegitimate and inappropriate to vote as soon as they are outside of their country of citizenship. And that reflects exactly the normative problems of external citizenship as they are usually discussed in the literature. Others, however, consider this simply part of their natural or national to nationalistic citizen rights. Yeah, you quote one in this sense, one person: "We are still Poles, and we have the right to decide what happens in our country." And then there's also a third possibility, a third position. People somehow in the middle, and apart from these liberal to nationalist extremes, who simply consider it their democratic responsibility as citizens to participate in their countries, home countries' elections. So also here, one would have liked to learn more about who is it actually who holds these different views according to the standard demographic sociological variables, education plus education and income, age, sex. One doesn't learn anything about these standard variables from this paper, and I found that was a lacuna. The diaspora is much handled like a black box without putting your finger into the internal variations of what you call diaspora. You know, if the Romanian diaspora is composed of rough sleepers, which is my impressionist impression walking through the streets right now, talking from Paris. They tend to lay on carpets in front of fancy brasseries, along with freshly newborn and the whole families. And very often these are Romanians. So this is one extreme of them. And then the other extreme is the academics, like my previous colleague, my dear colleague Irina Shornai in Bern. She, Eva, of course, knows her. She is also a Romanian diaspora person. So if rough sleepers and PhDs from the Autonomous University in Barcelona are both kind of entries in the Romanian diaspora, then it's an absolutely meaningless concept.
Thank you very much, Christian, for the comments. A lot of to digest here. Firstly, regarding why those communities vote so differently, and then this, I mean, all this comes back really to the questions of demographics, which is what you've been raising. To some extent, we know, and actually, the reviewers asked us to provide a lot of additional information. That's why this paper has 3 appendixes, which give at least some responses to your questions. Not all of them, actually, because yes, I mean, it's difficult to find space for all this. But you're right that those questions are important, and we try to signal whenever we thought that those things are particularly important. For instance, the length of stay as related to views on voting rights. We've been putting that in the paper itself, assuming that because certain migrants are contradicting this kind of usual view that the longer you're out there, the more inclined you will be to think that you don't really have a right to vote back home. We found examples going actually in the opposite direction, which is again not representative, and some people here in the chat, I know, have been raising this. It's possible that it's well, migration is selecting on certain people, so that different people go to Barcelona and different people go to Oslo. But it is, of course, also possible that it's the host country context which influences them. So we had examples of people from Barcelona saying, not just the ones who were thinking that it's political correctness and like orthodoxy, but also those who just said that when you are in Barcelona, you just start thinking differently because you're exposed to a lot of ideas which are much more left liberal than what they were used to back home. The question of why Polish migrants in Oslo voted so much to the right was actually one of the key questions that motivated me personally and us as a team to start this project in the first place. Another hypothesis was that migrants were exposed to this multicultural setting, but they are entering it at in a state of relative deprivation, in the sense that they feel declassed and that they're entering a new society at a lower level of social stratification. Then they perceive it differently, and through this some kind of disillusionment, they react with those populist and illiberal political expressions. However, I'm in a way happy to say that our aggregate findings show that migrants on the whole are actually more liberal and more GAL than their sending communities, which is a relief, but it doesn't mean that we did not explain outliers there, and we're not able to do this. We can say things about Oslo and Barcelona, but on the whole, we miss this kind of mid-range explanation, which would be possible if we were able to look at more countries in a slightly more, at a bigger level of granularity, but at the same time in a kind of representative fashion. And then the desire to vote, so for instance, by the Romanian population in Norway is exactly, in a way, as you said, it's dominated by those 2 categories that you that you mentioned, and we were even able, I mean, our fantastic research assistant here in the interviewer, Anatoly Koszczuk, has been able to talk also to the Roma in Oslo, who are not participating in elections, as you, well, it's not, probably not surprising, but we also got some really interesting insights from them regarding their perception of the host country and sending country, and generally they're thinking about citizenship as well. And that was really Anatoly's heroic attempt to do this, and which succeeded to an extent. Right. Thank you for those comments. I know we only have 8 minutes left, so if there are any comments from the panelists who would like to add something to this, or comments in the chat. There's one question for you, Marta.
Yeah, thanks, Marie-Lise. I think that's a very good point. And I'll definitely look into that in terms of, the question was about contingency within interviews and public opinion formation research in terms of trying to explain what's going on with that. And I think it's a very good suggestion, so we'll look into that. And then also building, I think, with what Maria was saying in terms of sort of really keeping this eye on here and there. And whether, yeah, so trying to sort of see what can we learn from looking at both the contexts to try and understand it. And probably also linking with the time variable. I think it probably does matter, the length of stay somehow, but not maybe in the most expected way. And then also, if I may just underscore this demography point, which I think is really important. I think also working on this project, it's really, I think, has shown how both of the work packages we have in this project are suffering because of challenges to be able to account for the demography in a proper way. So we clearly need to do another project where we are able to do that with a representative survey, which obviously can't cover all countries and all places and everything, but I think that is needed because we're really scratching at some really interesting stuff in both data sets, but we're not really able necessarily to do what we wanted to, perhaps, because we're not actually able to say who among the migrant population, say in Oslo, who we are able to account for more or less both in the Polish and Romanian, or indeed other cases as well, who they are. We more or less know that, but we don't know who among them were the ones that voted in 2015, for instance. And were these the same people who voted in the next elections where it seems they voted differently? Or did these guys return in the meantime? Or did they change their mind and vote differently? Did they return, or did they abstain from voting? And that's what we would want to know. And I think that research design is quite complex, but I think that's certainly a challenge that probably others also in this webinar could take up. I'd really like to look at that research, but actually also participate in it. So I hope we can collectively somehow push that.
Yeah, so there's a plea for a Horizon 2020 or some kind of a large ERC project there by Marta. And are there any more questions? I don't see anything in the Q&A. Or any comments? Ben, you wanted to comment maybe or on some of this, or Michał?
So maybe actually I have nothing to add to what Marta said, but I just want to say one thing, that when we are aware about limitations of our data. So I can say about quantitative data. However, by looking at this data, analyzing it forces us to question about more deeper issues, about more deeper things, and so we are being aware of that we are scratching on the surface. But this scratching, it raises another more research question, and I think it is, and so even if we end up with some unresolved issues, so I believe it's the way how the science works, that we start with something more simple and then we go deeper, and here we are on our way somehow.
I think that something that we can also say based on, and I sort of feel more comfortable saying this given some of the regularities that we've observed, is that while we don't have in all cases a clear handle on the exact socio-demographic profile of the diaspora communities in the countries of interest, that shouldn't lead us to assume that we're dealing with necessarily with groups of people whose behaviors as respect to participating in elections are going to be necessarily any different from those that they might exhibit back home. And we have street sweepers and academics in origin countries as well, and they exhibit certain regularities in their behavior with respect to participating in elections. So we can work on the assumption that while we may have somewhat different sociodemographic profiles in the communities of interest, that as at least a hypothesis that remains to be overturned, though those communities are going to be voting in ways roughly comparable to those that we might expect in terms of their turnout, at least. The question really that the migrant experience raises for me is not so much about the propensity to go and vote, the willingness to go and vote, but rather the practical barriers that certain communities face, which they might not face in their home countries. It's easier for the average person to go and cast a vote back in their country of origin. People who are part of a diaspora community in another country may be facing different challenges in terms of actually being able to cast a vote, which may have sort of asymmetrical impacts on their ability to do so. So that, I think, is the crucial thing to investigate now. It's not just the willingness to vote and and to express political forms of political expression, but crucially to look at the infrastructure that is available for voting and how that differentially impacts different sociodemographic groups, if indeed does so. Looks as if Kacper, you want to add something on this?
I just no, thanks for this. I basically just wanted to wrap up by saying that a lot of this is still, I mean, these are not final results. We are still working on the material. There's, as been said already a couple of times today, there's still a lot to work with. And 3 papers are in the pipeline. One is already hopefully coming out soon. A report is out from the qualitative research, a report from the quantitative research, so introducing the database and discussing some of the patterns that we see there is also going to be out soon, probably after the summer. And also a couple of other smaller outputs which you can find on the website. Yes, so I think that since we don't have any more time and also we don't have any more questions, I'll wrap it up here. Thank you very much for coming. Oh, there's one. Oh, okay, thank you. Thanks for coming. Please get in touch if you have any questions, comments, or would like to also contribute, because one of the ideas with Diaspolitik, at least initially, I'm not sure if we're not too overwhelmed by this by now, is that this database or this dataset should be actually continuously updated. And we've been trying to do this by adding elections until today. So the Bulgarian elections of this year have been added already. We will have elections from the Czech Republic as well. Michał is processing them already. So we're going to have 6 countries in detail. We do have the results from Slovenia, but which is a country that allows us to gather data, but the turnouts there are very, very low. So it's an important question whether it makes sense to make any statistical inferences based on 15 or 20 votes here and there. But the 6 countries that we are covering are probably important, and they will allow us to also do some interesting things on the host country side. Yes, so thank you very much for coming. Thanks to all the speakers and all the discussants and our entire advisory board. And have a great afternoon.